Following the end of the Second World War, Nazism and fascism became conflated by Western academics as one and the same. But there was a time when this perception was non-existent. There was a time when fascism and Nazism were viewed by even the general public as bitter enemies, staunch and irreconcilable opponents, both in their goals and in their methods. Though many today would be shocked to learn, during their heyday, most fascist leaders and movements vehemently opposed Nazi Germany, driven by their non-racial nationalism and strategic rivalry, as well as other ideological distastes. This opposition led the fascists of Europe to head towards a collision course against the Third Reich over the course of the 1930s. The stories of these anti-Nazi fascists reveal a dynamic completely ignored by modern academia, one demonstrating that the fascist political sphere shared little, if any, interested overlap with German National Socialism over the course of the entire interwar period, and in fact was at one point at the forefront of European resistance to Nazi aggression. This phenomenon, for quite some time, spanned the entire continent of Europe. To start with the most significant example, Fascist Italy from 1933 until 1936 positioned itself as a principled opponent of the Third Reich's agenda. In 1933, Mussolini signed the Italo-Soviet Pact explicitly directed against Germany. The following year, Mussolini deepened his containment strategy by signing the Rome Protocols with the fascist Chancellor of Austria, Engelbert Dollfuss, and Hungarian Prime Minister Gyula Gombos, creating a bloc intended to thwart Nazi influence in Austria and guaranteeing Italian military support to suppress the Austrian Nazi movement. Then, in July of 1934, Nazi agents assassinated Engelbert Dollfuss during a failed putsch. Mussolini reacted with furious resolve, mobilizing 40,000 to 50,000 troops to the Brenner Pass, and personally warning Adolf Hitler against any further intervention in Austria. Then, during the International Montreux Fascist Congress, in December of 1934, the German Nazi Party was deliberately excluded. The Fascist Congress, attended by movements all the way from Romania's Iron Guard to Austria's Heimwehr, totally rejected the Nazi model of anti-Semitism, denouncing their, quote, universal campaign of hatred against the Jews. In September of 1934, Benito Mussolini pledged to France to reject all German revisionist demands and even proposed a Pax Romana military alliance against Nazi expansion. This effort peaked with the Stresa Front in April of 1935, where Mussolini, alongside Britain and France, forged a united stand against Hitler's violations of the Versailles Treaty, reaffirming Austrian independence. However, this anti-Nazi front collapsed rapidly. Betrayed by the Anglo-German Naval Agreement of June 1935, Fascist Italy abandoned the strategy of collective security. Believing the Western powers would not enforce order, he launched the invasion of Ethiopia in October of 1935. The resulting League of Nations sanctions and international isolation drove Italy into a fateful rapprochement with Germany, proclaimed as the Rome-Berlin Axis, in October of 1936. This alliance resulted in Italy's 1938 racial laws, implemented to appease the Germans. Yet their enforcement was notoriously lax, undermined by widespread exemptions for Jewish veterans and fascist party members, and actively obstructed by high-ranking fascists such as Italo Balbo, who declared in Libya, quote, I do not differentiate between Catholic Italians and Jewish Italians. We are all Italians, unquote. According to the Holocaust Museum, Fascist Italy defied Nazi genocidal demands, refusing to deport Jews from Italy and protecting them in occupied territories, a source of constant frustration for Nazi leaders like Joseph Goebbels, who lamented in his diaries that fascism, quote, does not really dare to get down to fundamentals, unquote. Despite the official alliance, Italo Balbo maintained his vehement opposition to the prospect of Italy entering Hitler's war, as he predicted disaster, and argued against Italian involvement until the very moment Mussolini declared war on June 10th of 1940. This internal rift between the Fascist Party and Benito Mussolini's decisions exploded in July of 1943 when the Fascist Grand Council, led by figures including Dino Grandi and Mussolini's son-in-law Galeazzo Ciano, voted to remove Mussolini from power. Following the establishment of the German puppet state known as the Italian Social Republic, Mussolini himself denounced the occupation, stating Italy had become, quote, a people and a territory occupied as all the others are, unquote. Similarly, Austria's fascist regime under Engelbert Dollfuss and later Kurt Schuschnigg fiercely opposed the Third Reich's meddling in Austrian affairs. Dollfuss banned the Austrian Nazi Party in 1933, outlawing Nazi ideology in Austria entirely. In July of 1934, the Austrian Nazis attempted a coup, resulting in the assassination of Dollfuss by Nazi agents. Austrian fascist Kurt Schuschnigg succeeded him and continued to resist Nazi demands up until 1938, when the nation was annexed by Germany, resulting in Schuschnigg being interned into a series of concentration camps from then on until the end of the World War. Austria's vice-chancellor, Ernst Rudiger von Starhemberg, the leader of the Heimwehr, also vehemently opposed Adolf Hitler, even going so far as to serve with the French resistance and British forces following the fall of Austria in 1938. Over the course of 1932 until 1938, Austrian fascists crushed local Nazi cells and tried, ultimately unsuccessfully, to keep Austria out of the Third Reich. As Schuschnigg stated in 1938, quote, "There is no question of ever accepting Nazi representatives in the Austrian cabinet. An absolute abyss separates Austria from Nazism. We do not like arbitrary power. We want law to rule our freedom. We reject uniformity and centralization. Christendom is anchored in our very soil, and we know but one God, and that is not the state, or the nation, or that elusive thing race. Our children are God's children, not to be abused by the state. We abhor terror. Austria has always been a humanitarian state. As a people, we are tolerant by predisposition. Any change now in our status quo could only be for the worse." Unquote. The Prime Minister of Fascist Greece, Ioannis Metaxas, firmly rejected any alignment with Adolf Hitler. Metaxas maintained Greece's ties to Britain and resisted pressure from the Axis powers, though he ultimately passed away in January of 1941, shortly before Adolf Hitler personally invaded Greece. In Germany, Otto Schmidt-Hanover, a leading figure of the DNVP, and one of the nation's only prominent fascists, remained deeply hostile to National Socialism his entire life. A Prussian officer and parliamentary expert, he worked to channel Germany's popular discontent into fascist ideals and away from the Nazi movement. His opposition to the National Socialist movement resulted in Adolf Hitler singling Schmidt out as his own personal enemy. Waldemar Pabst, a ruthless Freikorps commander, infamous for orchestrating the executions of Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, was also one of the foremost faces of fascism in Germany. Pabst was briefly detained during the Night of the Long Knives and never joined the National Socialist German Workers' Party. Anton Hilkmann, perhaps the most important German fascist ideologue, while welcoming fascism as a Christian rebirth, condemned Nazism as the most narrow-minded nationalist agitation and an outwardly Bavarianized Teutoburutian barbarism. His 1931 essay, titled Problems of Panfascism, Is German Fascism Anti-Roman?, sparked a public debate between German Nazis and German fascists, a conflict which Hilkmann believed to be one between a universalist, Roman-inspired civic model, fascism, and on the other hand a racist, German Volkisch one, Nazism. For Hilkmann, fascism was compatible with Christian universalism and the nation-state, while Nazism was its heretical pagan opposite. This led the Nazis to condemn him, strip him of his doctorate, and sentence him by a special court. Fortunately, Hilkmann survived imprisonment in the Sachsenhausen and Buchenwald concentration camps. After the World War, he became a founding professor of comparative cultural studies at Mainz University. The founder of fascism, Georges Valois, spearheaded the Proudhon Circle in 1911 and in 1924, founded France's first fascist party, Les Fayeux. For most of the 1930s, Valois rebranded to refer to himself as a corporative syndicalist, only to embrace his earlier fascist ideals by 1940. When France fell to the Nazi occupiers, Valois joined the French resistance, where he helped to organize underground education and cooperative enterprises near Lyon, only to be arrested by the Nazis in May of 1944. Unfortunately, Valois died of typhus in the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp in early 1945. In France, yet again, we discover Colonel François de la Rocque, born in 1885. La Rocque led France's largest ever fascist movement, first through the veterans movement named Cross of Fire, and later as the French Social Party. Though de la Rocque held respect for Marshal Pétain as the legal and legitimate successor to the French government, he ultimately broke with the Vichy regime's pro-German line. By late 1942, he publicly declared that collaboration was incompatible with occupation, and began to secretly contact Allied intelligence. He organized the Rousseau Clan, a resistance network of former French Social Party members, who opposed both the Nazis and the Vichy regime. La Rocque also denounced Vichy France's forced labor, or STO, and threatened to expel any of his followers who joined Nazi militias. In March of 1943, the Germans arrested La Rocque, along with hundreds of French Social Party leaders, and he was deported to several prison camps. He was finally liberated by American troops on May 8th of 1945, only to pass away in 1946. In Ukraine, Stepan Bandera's faction of the Ukrainian Insurgent Movement, or OUNB, followed a similar pattern to all of the prior cases. In 1941, the OUNB declared an independent Ukrainian state in Lviv, resulting in retaliation from the Nazis, who demanded that Bandera revoke the declaration, which he refused. The German authorities arrested 1,500 OUNB leaders and activists on the spot. Stepan Bandera and fellow leader Yaroslav Stetsko were sent to the Sachsenhausen concentration camp in September of 1941, where they remained until 1944. While confined and facing execution, Bandera even rejected an offer to join a pro-Nazi Ukrainian committee. Thus, the OUNB's bid for Ukrainian independence turned it into an enemy of the Third Reich. By 1943, the OUNB issued secret orders for its members serving in German auxiliary police to desert with arms and join the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, or UPA. By then, the UPA was fighting all occupiers, whether German or Soviet. The formation of the Ukrainian Supreme Liberation Council, or UHVR, on July 15th of 1944 represented the peak of this anti-Nazi, anti-Soviet fascist resistance, formalizing it into a clandestine provisional government. Founded in the Carpathian foothills, the UHVR was designed as a broad political front, uniting the militant OUNB with centrist political parties like the Ukrainian National Democratic Alliance, or UNDO, the Ukrainian Socialist Revolutionary Party, and representatives of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. Its presidency was held by Kyrilo Ozmak, a socialist revolutionary from central Ukraine. The UHVR's explicit purpose was to direct the insurgent war and present a unified political alternative to both the Nazi and Soviet occupations. While it formed in territories still under German control, its mandate and actions were squarely opposed to German authority, coordinating resistance and absorbing other nationalist groups. After World War II, the UHVR continued to lead the guerrilla war and political opposition against Soviet rule until its suppression in the early 1950s. Its external representation abroad, active throughout the Cold War, worked to legitimize the cause of Ukrainian independence across the West. Belgium's most important fascist organizer, Paul Hornaert, led his nation's fascist National Legion. Hornaert pioneered fascism in Belgium, whilst simultaneously launching a staunch opposition campaign against German Nazism. He had initially anticipated conflict with Hitler, and when Belgium fell in 1940, Hornaert fled underground and founded the group Hornaert Directs, responsible for shooting multiple German SS troops. For his anti-Nazi activity, he was arrested by German police in 1942 and died in the Sonnenberg prison camp 2 years later in 1944. There was also Jan Baars, born 1903. An early Dutch fascist leader who opposed the Nazis as well. Baars founded the General Dutch Fascist Union, or ANFB, in the 1930s, and following the outbreak of World War II, he worked at the Civilian Supply Office and joined the Dutch resistance against the Nazi occupation. At his funeral, one of his old comrades, dressed once more in a black shirt, gave him what has sometimes been called probably the last fascist salute in Dutch history. In Czechoslovakia, General Radola Gajda led the Czechoslovakian national fascist community in the mid-1930s. Even before World War II, Gajda had already upheld an anti-German orientation. When Hitler demanded the Sudetenland in 1938, Gajda favored armed resistance or war with Nazi Germany over the Sudetenland rather than a single inch of concession. After the Munich Agreement of 1938, Gajda publicly returned his French and British honors as a gesture of defiance. Once Czechoslovakia was occupied in 1939, Gajda left politics and joined the armed resistance, facilitating escape routes for Czech officers into Poland and aiding his own son's anti-Nazi activities. This resulted in him being investigated by the Gestapo, though he managed to avoid imprisonment, only to be arrested after the war by the new Czech regime for allegations of so-called Nazi-fascist collaboration. Gajda passed away soon after release. In Poland, the National Radical Camp's Phalange wing, which had splintered from the National Democrats, formed the Underground Confederation of the Nation in 1940 to oppose Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia following the fall of Poland. This meant that they joined the mainstream Polish underground state. By 1944, many fighters from the Polish Phalange forces agreed to unite with the Home Army, Poland's chief resistance army, in order to centralize the struggle against the Nazis, which resulted in Polish fascist veterans ultimately fighting under the Home Army banner. Bolesław Piasecki, the founder of the ONR Phalange, later fought in both the Confederation of the Nation and their later merger with the Home Army alongside his own men. The most influential Israeli fascist, Ziv Jabotinsky, who founded the revisionist Zionist movement, was openly hostile to Nazism from the very establishment of the Third Reich. Jabotinsky called for strong measures against Adolf Hitler and worked tirelessly to rescue European Jews. As early as 1933, he wrote that the Jewish people, quote, hate the Third Reich phenomenon and must fight it. In a contemporary bulletin, he declared, quote, we are second to none as to hating the Third Reich phenomenon. The cases which have been presented reveal the fact that fascism consistently opposed Nazi Germany throughout the interwar and World War period. This, as one may observe, was clearly due to the fact that at the ideological core of fascism, man was conceived of as a communal spiritual being, integral to the nation no matter his particular innate characteristics. This doctrine, which flew in the face of Nazi ideology, formed the basis of fascism's international resistance to the Third Reich. Fascism always advocated for the sovereignty of the nation, standing in direct contradiction to the Third Reich's advocacy for the sovereignty of the race. Fascism, unlike National Socialism, was always a project of national regeneration rather than one of pan-racialism. The prioritization of the homeland over racial kinship led fascist regimes like the one in Austria to outright ban the Nazi Party. In the fascist worldview, there was never any place for the concept of a Nordic racial empire. Though academics may argue otherwise, the facts show that fascism and National Socialism were completely opposed from day one, not merely in the realm of theory, but also in the trenches of the Second World War.